Hello, welcome to Wednesday. Brother Dave here. I trust you're doing good, and I want to wish you a happy resurrection week and Passover, which has just started. So, last week I talked about the Passover or Paschal Lamb. Going to continue with that this week and give you a little more insight or understanding, at least as far as I know. And so let's get going. Now, let me say a prayer first. Dear Lord, I pray for all those within the sound of my voice that they would be blessed this week. They would find new meaning in life and realize the Passover lamb is actually just one of several sacrifices during the Passover week, but all has symbology and meaning for today. So let us all explore that together and look for meaning in things, even if we're not doing the physical act of sacrifice in a temple. Let's have a communal thing with our families in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so like I said, I talked about the Paschal Lamb some and Gates last week. The Paschal Lamb for the believer is none other than Christ Himself. We shall see here that the original intent of Passover was a family affair, not something done at the temple as a religious rite, although the Judaism took into place the sacrifice of the animals at the temple, but the actual ceremony of the Passover was home, a family event. I will further comment on how the new covenant believer is the temple of the Spirit, and sacrifices should be outside city gates. I won't focus on that maybe a little bit today, but let's look at the week in a broader view of sacrifice, especially during Passover, and how renewal of Passover is a blessing before impending judgment. Whoa. So, sacrifices during Passover. Some general things here. You may not sacrifice the Passover with any of your gates, which the Lord your God gives you, but at the place where the Lord your God chooses to make His name abide. That's out of Deuteronomy 16. Remember, we talked about Leviticus and Deuteronomy contention last week about how those were somewhat at odds with the manner, not the sacrifice itself, but where, inside the gates or not. When it comes to burnt offerings, after the consumption of the body in fire, it says in Leviticus 6, the priest shall take off his garments and put on other garments and carry the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. So that's to get rid of the ashes of the burnt offering. So obviously it's all burned up. All that we have is ashes. Besides the lamb, or that is of the sheep or the goats, other animals were sacrificed during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's the week right after Passover. It includes lambs, bulls, and rams. Lambs were sacrificed actually twice daily in the temple, the Tamid sacrifice, as a burnt offering. This was distinct from the Passover lamb sacrifice, which was done after the Tamid in the afternoon on the day of Nisan 14, or Abib 14, which originally called. Remember that Tamid sacrifice of a lamb was twice daily, a burnt offering, and not actually eaten. So you can't eat ashes, or at least I would not want to eat ashes. I'm sure they wouldn't taste very good. Also remember, leaven in bread represents sin, pride, or hypocrisy. So no leaven is allowed as part of the burnt offering for all of this feast. And again, the leaven would be in something like bread. That would be like with a sacrifice, like a sin sacrifice. Another of the animals sacrificed was the bull during this feast of unleavened bread. The bull of the sin offering and its skin and flesh and dung be burned with fire outside the camp according to Leviticus. Now, bulls got sacrificed on the first of each month, but also on special holy days like Passover. In Numbers 28, we read, "At the beginning of your months, you shall offer a burnt offering to the Lord, 2 bulls from the herd, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs a year old without blemish." Similar offerings were also during Passover and the Feast of Weeks as holy days, according to Numbers 28. The burnt offering is a voluntary offering for unintentional sins done in ignorance. It was to be a bull for the entire community. Now, a female goat or even fine flour could be afforded by the poor who couldn't get a whole bull. A ram was typically used for a trespass offering, which I won't talk about here, but that's violation of holy things unto the Lord, or trespasses against one another done wrong. And that was, if you remember the original text, it was 20% surcharge on top of making restoration. But this is not a lesson on sacrifices Israel offered up during the year, but let's look a bit on the Passover sacrifices during the future time, and let's look at Ezekiel's temple, which pretty much echoes what we see in the Torah. In Ezekiel chapter 45, "And the first month, on the 14th day of the month, you shall observe the Passover, a feast of 7 days. Unleavened bread shall be eaten." That's no leaven. "And on the day the prince shall prepare for himself," the prince of the kingdom to come, and you can take an understanding who that probably is. "The prince shall prepare for himself and all the people of the land a bull for a sin offering. On the 7 days of the feast he shall prepare a burnt offering to the Lord. 7 bulls, 7 rams, without blemish, daily for 7 days. And a kid of the goats daily for a sin offering. And he shall prepare a grain offering of ephah for each bull, and an ephah for each ram." That's where the grain comes in with the bull and the ram. "Together with a hin of oil for each ephah. In the 7th month, on the 15th day of the month, at the feast, he shall do likewise for 7 days, according to the sin offering, the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the oil." So that's out of Ezekiel chapter 45. Kind of mimics the whole idea of the offerings. And that kind of implies that this will be reinstituted during the millennial reign. At least that's what many suggest or believe. But being an outcast even from our own community sometimes occurs. Let's look in the book of Hebrews. Whether or not we're part of the citizenship of Israel, we are spiritually birthed into it, grafted in, according to the Apostle Paul. But whether we are of the commonwealth of Israel as actual Jews in the flesh, that remains to be seen. Anyway, being an outcast, let's look at Hebrews chapter 13, starting verse 10. "We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned outside the camp. Therefore, Yeshua also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate." As we talked about the suffering and sacrifices and the ashes outside the gate. "Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. For here you have a continuing city, but we seek the one to come." Okay. It says, we had no right to eat at this tabernacle. It's an altar. In this respect, we set up our own camp, if you will. It includes the altar of Yeshua outside the camp of Israel. We have a hope for an eternal city when the Lord Yeshua makes his abode with us and also in us. We do enter into the city by way of the high priest Yeshua, when his death actually tore open the curtain to the Holy of Holies upon his death. His blood was brought into the city. Some say the actual Ark of the Covenant was buried below Golgotha at the time of Christ's execution, so his blood did seep into the actual temple of God. I'm not sure about that. At least where the garden tomb, where some say he was crucified in front of the old Arab bus station today, is a little bit ways from a walk, I should say, not too far from the Temple Mount. But that's what people say. I think it might be a bit of a stretch, but it does highlight Christ's role as priest with the blood going into the Holy of Holies. Finally, remember that while the lambs are burnt up after the daily Tamim sacrifice, the paschal lamb is really not a burnt offering, and they don't burn it all up because you want to eat it. So it is taken home and roasted in the fire, then eaten that same evening in a family setting. Now, Christ's body was eventually consumed in the tomb on the third day, and it was transformed into like a heavenly flesh, and people didn't even recognize him at the tomb or on the road to Emmaus. It was different, but it was heavenly flesh and was resurrected that way. Let's look at the Passover renewal. In this case, let's start with King Josiah. That's out of 2 Chronicles chapter 35 and 2 Kings chapter 23. And there's some implications for us today with what King Josiah did. Sometimes we forget about Passover because other issues can come in or creep in, but we can renew ourselves and even all of society to the Lord's feasts and begin anew anytime we're ready. In 2 Chronicles chapter 35, it says there had been no Passover kept in Israel like that since the days of Samuel the prophet. And none of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as Josiah did. With the priests and the Levites, all Judah and Israel who were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now, 2 Kings is slightly different in chapter 23, verse 22. Such a Passover surely had never been since the days of the judges who judged Israel, nor in the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. So you take it, whether it was since Samuel the judges. The time from Samuel to Josiah was a space of 300 to 400 years. They give a kind of a gap. I haven't got the exact number of years. I don't know if it's available. But 2 Kings reference could be extend this to maybe 440 years if it was time of judges. Unfortunately, though, Josiah was killed in battle, and 10 or 15 years later, as Judea slipped more and more into apostasy. I want to point this out. This Passover, unlike for a long time, roughly corresponds this Passover of Josiah to the period of Israel being in exile in Egypt, which, of course, the Passover commemorates the freedom upon the 10th plague and the freedom from bondage, freedom from everything that was holding them in place under Pharaoh. Again, when Joseph had gone down there and his brothers joined him, and it was all hunky-dory and fine for a while, at least until Joseph died. And then later on, there was another Pharaoh who didn't think that, made them even make bricks without straw, of all things. Hard life, slavery. And that's what Passover is all about, freedom from slavery. We could all be slaves to sin these days. So we have slavery in certain ways. Some of us don't realize it. Even Apostle Paul recognized this fact that it was in a body of sin. And he said, who will rescue me from this body of sin? As he struggled also with the flesh, just like all the rest of us. So, we too can be renewed with a reprieve of pending judgment, just like Josiah. I think President Trump is one such reprieve in modern times, although other people will not agree with that. But prayer in the White House, of course, is a great start. Trump has been called a modern-day Cyrus, and that maybe he needs to let the captives of Persia return to their homeland. That's another thought, a Cyrus, just like the original Cyrus. Let the Jews go home. But maybe that's the ultimate aim of the whole war, and people don't realize this whole thing with Iran is not about beating Iran or putting them into the ground or making them pro Western, but it's all about the Jews, and God's doing something for the Jews there. And I forget the number there. It's somewhere between, I want to say 20 and 100,000, but I don't remember the actual number. But at any rate, um, the end did eventually come for Judah after Josiah died. Perhaps the same fate will happen in America or elsewhere after Trump. Who knows? The real question is whether the angel of death will continue being held back. We have to properly apply the blood of the Passover Lamb to the doorposts and the lintels of each and every one of our own lives. That's important to remember at Passover. Yeshua himself renews the Passover at the Last Supper. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Master's death until he comes." We're proclaiming that. Many churches do the Eucharist. It's called every week, every month or so, but it was really a one-time-a-year event when it was initiated by the Lord himself, one time a year, that is. Remember the blessings over the bread and the wine. In Matthew chapter 26, as they were eating, Yeshua took bread, blessed it, he broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink it all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." So again, some of the people didn't understand him about the blood and the flesh, eating his blood or drinking his blood and eating his drinking his blood and eating his flesh. And some might have thought cannibalism. Other maybe he was saying things that they couldn't do, like eating blood. Remember the Seder dinner, and it's on this time of year, Passover. It's a dinner. It's not just the bread and the wine. It's a whole dinner. There's courses and 4 cups of wine and bitter herbs and either a shank bone or maybe lamb. Sometimes you might even have chicken. I don't know. I've had roast beef at some. It's a nice meal. Bitter herbs is pretty hard. Horseradish is pretty bad. If you've had it once, you'll remember it for your life. But we partake of only juice and bread. We are actually abbreviating the original ceremony, including the Last Supper. But I wanted to tell you a blessing, and I'm going to try to do my best Hebrew here. So the Lord took this bread and the cup, and he made a blessing. So there's blessings during the Seder. And there was a blessing over the wine, which is a kiddush, before drinking each of the 4 cups. And the last, I believe, is the redemption. In Hebrews, it says, "Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam borei peri hagafan." Means, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine. And then the bread, there's a blessing of the matzah, which is unleavened bread. It's recited after the washing of hands, but before eating the matzah is the blessing, and it's called the bread blessing is called hamotzi, and let's see, it says Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam hamotzi rekem min ha'etz, meaning, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. So remember, this Passover, or if you're celebrating Resurrection Sunday, remember to say a blessing to the Lord for his bread, his flesh given to the remission of sins, and the wine, or his blood, given for forgiveness. Because without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin. And that's what he did for us at the cross. So remember that. It's the most holy time of the year. I want to say bless you, and may you be newness of life and resurrection, and draw closer. And it's Corban, it's the sacrifice, means to draw closer to the Lord through our sacrifices, and they aren't always through bulls and cows or even through lambs. They can be sacrifices, our time, our talent, our energy, and sometimes through prayer as well is a good way. So God bless you, and be blessed this week. Amen.